You should see that now. So hello and welcome. This is the fourth webinar in the Unpacking the Essential Understandings webinar series. Tonight there is much to cover in Essential Understanding number 5 on the federal policy periods, so my introduction will be brief. Watch the chat for important links and information throughout the webinar. I will usually post things several times. The sign-in sheet is open, so if you're seeking renewal units, please make sure to put your name on the sign-in sheet, but also please put your name and where you're teaching in the chat, so we can log that if you are seeking renewal units. And then there is a renewal unit survey at the end. It will open up the last 15 minutes and only be open for 24 hours. So please make sure to get that done. And if you are not getting renewal units, we would love it if you would fill out the survey anyhow, because we really take your feedback to heart and try to reach out to each of the comments if there's resources being requested, and try to meet your needs. So, and also feel free to message me directly if you have any questions throughout the webinar. And with that, I will welcome our presenters, Miranda Murray and Jordan Langford Forrester. And take it away, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. It was interesting last Wednesday. We had a break in our sessions, and so it was interesting not to be with you guys last Wednesday.
Not any less fun. We didn't have more fun without you.
It was just different. So welcome back, everybody. We're glad to have you here. We do, as Jen said, have a lot to cover today. So again, Miranda Murray, Indian Ed for All instructional coach here in Great Falls Public Schools and co-facilitator for Bright Trail Education.
Hi, I'm Jordan Langford Forster. My Aani name is Bright Trail Woman, and I am a co-facilitator for Bright Trail Education, also within the Great Falls District and Indian Education for All instructional coach. So that means that we assist other educators in our district with implementing Indian Education for All in their content and curriculum. We just want to thank OPI for allowing us to facilitate our live webinar series. The Unpacking the Essential Understanding portion is more about simplifying the essential understandings. In the late 90s, folks got together from all around the state, some tribal leaders, and created these essential understandings, and they are multi-layered and multifaceted. So this Unpacking the Essential Understandings is more about just kind of simplifying them and kind of knowing where to start with them. And then our deeper dives are more for providing more examples of lessons and more resources of how you can use it. Throughout this webinar series tonight, we will be providing you with some resources. But with that, we'll get started. This is what we're going to be sharing with you tonight is about 500 years of history. So it's a lot of information. We're going to try to be as helpful as we possibly can with that. And we will go ahead and get started. We're going to start with a scenario. So we would like you to read the scenario when you see it on your screen. Oh, yep, there it is. Okay, so please reflect on the scenario and respond in the chat. So the federal government is implementing a nationwide curriculum and will be revising all grade level content standards. This will be implemented in the following time frame. So you have science to be implemented in April of 2021. It will be evaluated and changed in 2024, and so on and so forth with social studies, English, math, fine arts, financial tech, and life skills. But we would like you just to reflect on this for a moment, and please respond in the chat your thoughts and feelings concerning your ability to be prepared to disseminate this information to students if it's constantly being changed. How knowledgeable would you be in the material if it's always changing, and or maybe how flexible, how quickly would you be able to change these new implementations within your classroom? So I'll give you a couple moments to reflect on this and respond in the chat. Essentially, how would you feel if this happened? Maybe any frustrations you might have. And what are you stressed?
Yeah, that's a great connection. It would be difficult to feel confident that you're teaching the correct information. I would imagine a lot of us are also a little bit familiar kind of with this feeling in terms of curriculum.
Just a couple more moments to reflect and respond in the chat. The schedule makes no sense. Overwhelmed. So we're seeing a lot of overwhelmed, and that would probably be a rational feeling, something to be expected. So the reason that we start out with that scenario is it's just a good way to connect with what we're going to be discussing tonight. So this is the timeline of American Indian federal policy. So historians categorize Indigenous federal policies into 6 different periods of time throughout the history of European interactions. Historians begin categorizing these policies beginning with colonization. We've changed the timeline. So this is our own timeline that we've created, but we've changed the timeline because we acknowledge that tribes had governmental structures since time immemorial and outside of the federal government. So we've adjusted the timeline to recognize the sovereignty and self-sufficiency of tribes before 1492. So that's the time immemorial that you're seeing there on the bottom. We would just like you to take a few moments to look at this timeline and reflect in the chat box anything that you notice about this timeline. Maybe something having to do with its structure, how long certain federal policies have been implemented for. So we'll give you a couple of moments to do that, and then we'll make the connection as to why we started with the scenario revolving around curriculum. So anything that you notice about this timeline, anything that jumps out at you.
Lots of great connections being made in the chat. Thank you for your participation. And I hope that, as always, when you are reflecting and putting your answers in the chat, if you're willing to share, that you're also taking the time to see some of the other people that are participating, their reflections and their answers, and make some connections to other people's learning as well.
Right, and so we lay this timeline out horizontally too, just because when the dates are lined up vertically, I think it doesn't provide the visual context that people need to understand what federal policy actually looked like for American Indian people. And so the reason that we have it out horizontally is so you can see that overlap, and a lot of people made some connections with the overlap. Also, it's important to remember that a lot of these federal policies that happened during these time periods conflicted with each other, and some didn't have a chance to end before others began. And so that's why we start out with that scenario that revolves around curriculum and teaching is because we just want people to put themselves in that position of how that would feel. And so it's really, really hard to get a strong footing, build strong communities, really be able to put your community first. So we get the question a lot of times like, well, it doesn't seem like reservations can really, get it together. They just seem so disorganized. And what people don't really understand is that it's not that American Indian people can't get it together. It's that they have been regulated in a way that has made it very difficult to build a strong foundation. It's very difficult to build a strong foundation when every couple of years or generation, you have kind of the rug pulled out from underneath you. And and we do see that with curriculum a lot of times too. So we roll out a new curriculum and it really depends on who's in charge or who's at the top. And then they might say a couple years later, like, no, we tried that. Now we're going to go in this direction. We're going to try something totally new. And so again, it's really hard to, feel prepared, to understand what's going on, to really be able to build a strong community when constantly that rug is being pulled out from underneath you. And the federal government decides, okay, now we're going in this direction. Now we're going to change things up. And so again, that's why we have it laid out in a horizontal way, because I think it's more impactful when we're viewing things like conflict and overlap with federal Indian policy.
Yeah, I would say that the overlap of these policies, it has a big part to play in the way that these federal policies have played out over time, and that confusion in those federal policies.
It's also important to remember that these federal policies made American Indian people the most regulated people within the United States. And so when you have all of these laws that literally, if you don't follow, you're literally breaking the law, it's really hard to maintain or regain your sovereignty. And we'll talk more about sovereignty when we get into Essential Understanding 7, but it's really important to know that these federal policy timelines had a significant impact on tribal sovereignty that we still see today.
So with that, we have Essential Understanding number 5. So Essential Understanding number 5 says there were many federal policies put into place throughout American history that have affected Indian people in the past and continue to shape who they are today. Many of these policies conflicted with one another. Much of Indian history can be related through several major federal policy periods, and then they're listed below as you saw in the timeline. And so we're going to follow the same format. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Jennifer can put up the Menti. So I will copy and paste the Essential Understanding into the chat so that you can review that. And I want you to pick out some words that stick out to you as being important parts of that Essential Understanding. And you can go to the Menti.
So you can go to menti.com. You can see the address and the code at the top of my screen. And unless I can't see it because there's a notification. Anyhow, so menti, menti.com. And then put in the code 9064403. And if you cannot, for some reason, access a different website from whatever device you are on, please feel free to answer in the chat as well. And what's going to happen with this is you'll see it populate, and then I will save it as a PDF, and I will put it into the Google Drive folder, the participant folder. So if you'd like to access it at a later time, it will be there for you.
And just enter any words that you notice, any words that you feel are important. How can we begin to start breaking Essential Understanding 5 down into maybe more simplified version if we're sharing it with our students or other people?
There we go.
If you haven't had the opportunity to use this resource in your classroom, it really is a great way to see where your students are at for a variety of different purposes, because the words that are showing up bigger are the words that are put in more often, or answers that are entered more often. And so this really is a good visual to see those words that stick out for the essential understanding in our case.
So it looks like a lot of participants are entering conflicted. We have affected, continue to shape.
Miranda, would you mind putting the essential understanding in the chat again? We just had a handful of folks joining us.
No problem. If you are just joining us, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 9064403. And utilizing the essential understanding that it's written in the chat, you can pick out some words that are important to you or stand out as words that are important to this essential understanding. Just a couple more moments.
And again, for those of you who have joined us a little bit later, I will be saving this as a PDF, and it will be available in the Google Drive resource folder for participants.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on. Thank you for participating in this activity. So on the screen momentarily, you will see the words that we have chosen as words that stick out, or as important words that we'll be focusing on, especially today when we're presenting to you.
Yeah, so again, those essential understandings, they are very informative, but are multi-layered and multifaceted. So how do we use them in a way that makes the most sense for our students or anyone that we're having conversations to? I know that not everyone's an educator on here, and that's fine, but just like how do we introduce these concepts to people who might not understand them? So these are just our words that we use how to begin the conversation with our children. These aren't the be all end all words. We just wanted to give you an example of how we start this. So, I really start talking to my students about, I teach high school, and I say, okay, federal policies. What's a different way to say policies? Essentially laws. So laws throughout history have been making American Indian people, the most regulated group in America. And these policies continue to affect American Indian people, not only because they conflicted with each other, but they weren't always beneficial. And just because something might have happened in the past, you're still dealing with the effects of that. If you think of any law that might be done and over with in the history of the United States, we still might have some consequences from that, some dealing with foreign policies and other logistics around that. Just because laws were created in the past doesn't mean that that's where they stop. And certainly in this situation, because of that conflicting way that they were implemented, it makes it very difficult to build a strong community at times I'm not saying that it's not possible, because we certainly do have strong Native American Indigenous communities in the state of Montana. But, just when I get those questions of, it doesn't really seem like they can get it together. Why can't the reservation get it together? And it's like, well, we are talking about a people that are resilient enough to survive colonization, removal, assimilation, reservation and allotment, reorganization, termination, relocation, and now in the later 70s, just entering self-determination. It's gonna take a little bit longer than 1975 to get our communities where we would like to see them.
So we are going to be throughout our evening watching a video interview with a co-teacher of ours. Her name is Jen Duda, and she is going to be talking about how she teaches federal policy in her classroom, and she teaches 5th grade. So let me make sure that you have sound. Sorry, I can't
And I
click the
teach
button.
5th grade in Great Falls Public Schools. For students to know. I think in general with federal policy, it's such a hard topic to cover that people think, oh, this is too hard. These kids aren't going to understand it. We're just going to either ignore it, or they'll get it later in high school. They'll get it in college. But I do think that federal policy can be brought down to, simple elementary grade levels by turning, whatever the issue is that we're wanting to talk about into the level that the kids can understand, and into something simple that you can break down, whether it's, using maps to show different reservations, or any subject can be incorporated, but it's easy to just take a big topic and then you can focus on one or even two small little things. You don't have to go crazy, just do little things along the way, and that's enough. Like it's easier than you think to incorporate IFA and standards into your teaching. It can be a 1-minute conversation about, reservations and land when you're doing your geography lesson in Montana. Like it doesn't have to be this whole 45-minute lesson that you are stressing out and going, oh, I have to hit my IFA lesson for the week or for the month. That's not the point. That's not how it should be. It can be incorporated anywhere. We're doing our geography on, the mountain ranges. And so we talked about the different tribes that lived in the mountain ranges versus the tribes that lived on the plains. How were they similar? How were they different? What were some of the things that one group hunted versus the other groups planted? And we talked about their different homes and their different clothing and their different resources and their different food needs. It doesn't have to be this whole crazy lesson. I mean, it can just be a simple conversation. We talked about the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers and their tributaries and the river systems. Okay, so let's talk about fishing. Let's talk about food sources. Let's talk about why we live near the water and things like that. It doesn't have to be, it can just be little bits here and there every day, just so that those students realize that this is important history and that their culture matters, and they can see themselves represented in things like that, and their ancestors represented in things like that. I honestly think the benefit for them is being able to see two sides of something and being able to decide, this seems a little fishy. There's got to be another side, or there's got to be another story, or, reading one thing and going, well, I wonder how the other side felt. Being able to have that sort of ability to decipher, well, there's got to be another side, or there's got to be more to this story. That can happen at any age. Teach them that young. Teach them to question things young, so that as they grow older, it's easier for them. When we talk about Columbus Day, that's another interesting holiday. I use the book Encounter by Jane Yolen.
Okay. Sorry about that. The captions from the Zoom are in the way of the pause button. So working on some technical difficulties there. Thank you.
What I appreciate about Jen's interview is that she really makes it a point to say that, federal policy, so again, she teaches 5th grade, federal policy can be overwhelming if you're talking or trying to explain it to those younger grade levels. And so it doesn't have to be a lesson in its entirety. When you are moving through different topics, you can very easily, naturally infuse this conversation into conversations that you're already having.
And I hope that you hear us repeat that throughout. That's something that we've talked about a lot, is that it doesn't need to be a separate thing. She'll talk about that a little bit more and later when we see her again. But we really want you to be incorporating these conversations throughout your curriculum that you're already teaching instead of apart from or aside to.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to begin with colonization as it relates to our timeline. Again, we always like to recognize time immemorial, and that really has a lot to do with that essential 1, essential 2, and essential 3. And so really building a strong foundation of sovereignty and how American Indians were before these federal policies started affecting them, especially in the area of Montana. So we're going to begin with colonization. We're going to have so that's going to be the colonization period, is really that expansion and exploration of European countries, really beginning with encroachment for the older kids. And if it's applicable to middle school or maybe 5th grade, we read excerpts out of Columbus and his diary. We're going to be doing that when we meet again for Essential Understanding 6. But I also know that the OPI website has revised some lessons around Thanksgiving, and that's really important conversations to have with students to just kind of change their mindset of what it actually looked like from an Indigenous perspective once colonization began. We will share a video of how Jennifer
grow older, it's easier for them. When we talk about Columbus Day, that's another interesting holiday. I use the book Encounter by Jane Yolen. I really like this book. You can do so much with this book. I do a figurative and literal language lesson with this book just because it's written so well. You can do an art lesson with it because the art is so beautiful. Different things like that. I did an inference lesson on it last year where I just showed them the pictures because some of these pictures they say a lot. So I did an inference lesson with them and we just showed them the pictures first, and they told me, what was the mood, what was going on, what did they think was happening. And then we went and read the story so they got to see. But it does, this story is great. It talks about the natives' perspective of Columbus coming over, because all these kids are being taught in our history books is Columbus's version of coming over and how that all worked out. So just giving students both perspectives, I think, is really, really important, no matter what the topic is. We're talking about the European explorers right now in history, and we're talking about Columbus's voyage and him landing in the wrong place. So that's a geography lesson. That's a math lesson with distance across the ocean. That's a cultural lesson with, he was looking for gold and spices, and he lands down in the Caribbean and doesn't find those things. It doesn't have to be harder than that. It can be easy. It can be little bits all the time that the teacher doesn't have to stress about, and then the students don't have to go, it's time for our weekly Indian lesson, because that just doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel good. Like, it's time for our, let's open our books. It's our Indian lesson or our Native American time. That just seems weird. I enjoy, and the kids enjoy, it's just incorporating it all the time. We talk about it in math when
So as Jennifer shared, there are a lot of resources and a lot of ways to talk about colonization or the colonial era era, and really hitting on that 1942 to like present. I know on that screen before we had a different date, but when you think about how that has affected today and how those policies and how just those actions and the settlements and all of those things have affected today, it's still happening, right? So really kind of looking at how that is happening presently. So two of the resources on your screen are elementary specifically, but can be used for high school aged kids as well, because as Jennifer was saying, you don't just have to use books in a way where you're like sitting and reading the book to kids. And even though high schoolers also like to be read to, you can utilize these resources in different ways to teach other things you're teaching. So she gave an example of an inference lesson, looking at images. You could do a writing assignment where you show an image from one of these books. Both of them have really beautiful artwork. And your students could really take on a writing assignment of predicting or thinking about, based on that imagery, what they think is going on. There's a lot of writing that could happen there. There are some other resources on your resource list. I forgot to put this up on the screen, but this book is called Rethinking Columbus, and it is full of lesson plans and ideas and primary source documents that you can use to teach around the idea of Columbus. But it's also important to think about, like, it doesn't just have to, Columbus is not the only person that is involved in the colonization and colonial era. I do think that we probably have more resources that are classroom friendly and ready to go that have to do with that person. But if you join us for the deeper dive, we will definitely be going over some other resources or how to use these in your classroom.
So after colonization began, we have treaty and removal, and that's the treaties were those legal documents, those agreements that are signed all across the United States with tribes. There was really, we see how federal policy is changing, and it's really important to when we look at federal policy to see, or to, I guess, to analyze what the needs of the United States was at the time. So once the federal government is established and it now becomes a nation-to-nation relationship, it's really important to look at why some of these federal policies were written, and who do they benefit once they're written, once they're implemented, because laws always benefit one side more than they do the other. It's rarely a mutual thing. We don't really see a lot of mutual working together until we get into self-determination. But treaty and removal, so these agreements are signed all across the United States, and new boundaries are established, because after colonization, the influx of it really began to pick up. What the colonists were realizing is, we're going to need more land. And so you see different boundaries being established. And then with removal, obviously, the removal of a lot of tribes from the East Coast into what they were beginning to designate as Indian territory or Indian country. And this is really a separation of races through removal. And I think that would be easy to naturally incorporate to conversations that you might be having with your students about what segregation means, what the separation of races actually mean, what's the intent of that, why are we making those laws, or why are we feeling like those laws are okay. Just again, a way to naturally infuse it into conversations that you might already be having with your students.
When we're thinking about resources, apart from using books, because a lot of the resources we share are online resources or book resources, and these are a couple of books that you can talk about the subject of treaty making and removal with. But it's also a good idea that you could use primary source documents to be talking about treaties. You could be looking at those kinds of documents. There are lots of really great primary source documents available online. We'll talk about that in a deeper dive. but utilizing variety of forms of incorporating and introducing information to your students, I think, is really important. Sitting Bull Remembers is a story kind of following Sitting Bull's life and him kind of looking back and talking about the treaties and removal as well. And then we have, of course, Fool's Crow by James Welch as being a great story to go along with this topic.
So we have treaty, we have removal, and the federal government took removal a step further. And again, we see a shift in resources that were being prioritized. So we have the treaty and removal around those, away from the areas that the gold rush was big in, that plantations were starting to be built in. And so the treaties were establishing boundaries. Removal was designating certain areas as Indian territory or Indian country. Then we have a push for a reservation system because the federal government is moving what they prioritize as resources away from gold after the gold rush is starting to die out to that resource need for things like timber, grazing land, because the cattle boom is beginning. And so reservations are beginning to become more necessary in their eyes as a way to really consolidate American Indian people into specific places. So with assimilation, we have the majority culture absorbing what is now the minority culture. So we have reservations established, we have Indian agents surveying land, all sorts of things taking place. They're starting to realize that the reservation system is really consolidating groups of like-minded people together. And that's where we see the introduction of assimilation. So when we move them together, the population isn't decreasing or declining, it's actually growing. So how do we begin the process of really being intentional of removing that culture piece? And we begin with the assimilation, so that removal of the next generation of, unfortunately, children from homes. There's the Allotment Act, which was designating the individual head of household 160 acres, because and that's, a form of assimilation too, regulating how American Indian people lived and how they made a living for themselves. There's a really big push for farming, farmlands, the cattle industry. So we get that allotment period as well. The Snyder Act came along in 1924, and that involved Indigenous voting. So that push to really assimilate in that form too. I think that the Snyder Act is wonderful, because I feel like if you're living within the boundaries of the United States and following all of the rules, that essentially makes you a citizen of the United States. But unfortunately, it wasn't until 1924 that American Indians received that official right to vote, which is a little bit weird because they had already fought on behalf of the United States in World War I. And even though the 15th Amendment stated that all US citizens had the right to vote, not all states complied. So that Snyder Act was enforced in 1924 to essentially make sure that American Indian people had the right to vote. That doesn't mean that all states were complying. The National Guard had to go into the state of Maine well into the 30s to make sure that American Indians were allowed to vote. Other places, and we see that too when you're having conversations with Black Americans and their rights to vote. It wasn't until the 1960s that they still had to come up with laws and acts to ensure that citizens of color were being allowed the right to vote.
So when we think about resources that we can use, like I was saying earlier, you can also use primary source documents. So if you're thinking about talking about the allotment, and so then we have surplus land for sale, you can utilize these kinds of images that go along with that act. So you can take this into your classroom, students can read it and analyze it. You can find this Grand Rush for Indian Territory, the one on your left. You can find that online written out so that you can read it more clearly, because images of this scanned document sometimes are a little hard to read the fine print, but it is really valuable information to share and to analyze with students. Jordan does a really cool exercise in the classroom with students, and they look at this and they talk about it and they ask, who is this for? What is the message they're sending? We also are going to see a ton of resources in this era, or books that support resources in this era, especially when it comes to boarding schools. There are a lot of books on a wide variety of age levels that support boarding, telling the story of boarding school, either through a fictional history perspective or a non-fictional history perspective. And so there are a lot of really grade appropriate, like for classroom reading. We as instructional coaches like to check out classroom sets whenever possible, to be able to get books in kids' hands so they can support their learning with reading themselves. A lot of times when we're faced with finding books for our classroom, it's expensive to get more and more resources. And so a lot of times you're getting maybe one copy of a book, and so then you're reading to your students. And while this is super valuable in terms of listening skills and comprehension and lots of connections to be made to oral tradition, it's also really important for our students to be getting reading materials in their hands, and whether that be reading to themselves for comprehension or reading out loud. I oftentimes am repeating about language in our classrooms, and I think that alongside with introducing new language and repeating language for our students, especially concerning Indian education for all topics that they might not get in other places or they might not have heard before, it's just as important for them to be able to experience talking about those things and reading about those things, sharing with their partners and their classmates about those things as well, so that they can build on that vocabulary.
I use the Plenty Coup Chief of the Crows book for my high schoolers. I think it's a really great example of the transitional period from sovereign living. So there's some accounts of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but then just him to tell the story of his life and how it changed. So we go from the treaty period through reservation and allotment, and he just does a really good job. Frank Linderman also assisted him in writing this book, but I think it's a really good example of the transitional time frame, because it's important to remember again with that timeline is that things just didn't start and stop. You had generations of people who lived through multiple different federal policies, and it's a really great way to just let students know that nothing happens in freeze frame. Lives continue, cultures change and evolve over time, and it's really cool to see his account of that.
Some of the books on the left are, so My Name is Pizza and Sweetgrass Basket are chapter books. They would be great reading materials for 5th, 6th through middle school up into high school. I have teachers in high school that are using these books as well. My Name is Pizza is in a letter format, which is a really cool opportunity to look at that writing format and how that is incorporated into your own teachings. Cheyenne, again, is a children's book. It is pretty dense with text, so there's a lot of information to be read in there. But if you join us for the deeper dive, we have a lot more resources and ideas on how to incorporate boarding school books information with your classroom so that they have all of that information to read. I got ahead of myself and didn't share. We have a portion of the video that we would like to share with you where Jen is speaking about the era that we are just shared with you. So let me get that video ready and I will.
We talk about it in math when, we talk about the reservations in Montana. I mean, that's an easy thing to do. How big are the reservations? How many people live on the reservations? You can talk about math all day with that kind of stuff. So one of the things that I like to do is get out multiple books on one topic area, like let's say Thanksgiving or with boarding schools and things like that. I like to get lots of book samples out for them, and then instead of when they're done with an assignment, they go pick up one of those books and they read those books, and then we talk about those. We do different reading circles and reading centers. I make sure all the books are different. Maybe it's a picture book today, maybe it's a letter book, maybe it's somebody's story that they have written. Whatever it is, they can then get that background knowledge so that when we go talk about things like Native American boarding schools, they remember they've seen those pictures, we've got letters, how they've seen the kids like before and after. So when the kids have these book options that they go look at, I always leave a piece of paper there for them to sign that shows that they've been at each book or been at each station. And they get to write down something that they have a question about. They get to write down something that was either interesting to them or that they found fascinating. I'll usually get stuff that they'll say, well, I can't believe this happened. So they like to talk, then that's their new learning. They like to talk about things that they've just learned. But yeah, they say leave a comment and write your name. So then that way I know when everybody's had a chance for the book. And then we talk about them as a class and things like that. But those are just simple, easy things that you can do that don't even take time. Because kids finish activities at different rates all the time. So I put different books around the room. Go visit a book that you haven't seen yet. This week it's on Columbus and the different explorers. So there's different explorer books around the room. And some Columbus books also. I want them to have both perspectives. Primary and secondary sources. I want them to see all of that. One of my kids today noticed that in Columbus's journal entries, it said how strong and beautiful the native tribe was, and how they were so smart and quick learning, and they were like, oh yeah, that's so nice. And then it says they will make perfect slaves, and the kids were just like, what? So I do think it's important to show them both sides so they can learn history and make up their mind for themselves. We can't just sugarcoat everything, no matter how old they are. We bring it to their level so that they understand, but it's really, really important that we share history with them accurately and not just one side. A lot of ahas that I've seen relate to the Native American boarding schools, the treatment, the just explaining to them at their level. I do that a lot. I'll say that would be like me picking you up. You don't know me picking you up and your little 5-6-year-old brother. You have to come with me. I'm a stranger. We don't speak the same language. I'm not the same color as you. That would be like me taking you from your mom and dad, putting you on a train, sending you to a school. There's other kids around that look like you, but you don't know any of them. You might not speak the same language as them. And then you wouldn't be able to go home, maybe ever, right? You're not allowed to talk to your sibling. When you put it to them like that and then, you get soup for lunch every day, and then you have to march for hours and hours, and then you have to learn a trade when you're 8, 9, 10 years old. When you explain it to them like that, they're like, hold on a second, that's crazy. And you're like, yeah, I know it's crazy. Do you get it now? Like it is crazy. And this happened to kids their age and younger than them. So of course they can relate to that. And of course they can relate to those types of things. I I honestly think that the students walk.
All right. So just like Jen was saying, and I think you'll hear us say this quite a bit throughout, is that all of what we have to share is overlapping. There's always going to be essential understandings that pertain to each other. So when she's talking about giving students the opportunity to compare and decide for themselves and find information out from both sides of the story, she's really referring to essential understanding number 6, which we will be coming up on here in a week or two. But every time that you are looking at materials and trying to figure out how you want to incorporate it into your curriculum, it's really hindering if you're trying to, sometimes we see teachers try and hit all 7 essential understandings at the same time. And that's just overwhelming, especially if you're starting out or navigating how you're trying to incorporate, how you're trying to find your flow of EFA in your classroom. But it's totally doable to focus on 1 essential understanding or 2. You're going to find a lot of times when you choose a resource, which is why with, when we're sharing with teachers who are trying to get their feet on the ground about how to do this in a meaningful way, why we share so many books is because books are such a great way to introduce information. And it's a great way for our teachers, especially our teachers that maybe don't feel confident in their understanding or their knowledge, to start sharing information because they're reading something that they feel confident in and that they can share with their students. And you're always going to find multiple essential understandings in the books that you're choosing, in even if you just look at OPI lessons that we sometimes share on here, when you go through in the top, it's going to list the essential understandings you're hitting. And rarely is it just 1, it's usually a couple, because a lot of these are intertwined and layered and connected, just like we say at the beginning of every class, which is why sometimes it can be overwhelming. So you just kind of choose those little bits at a time to help you get started.
All right, so we're changing it up again. In 1926, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sent out surveyors all over the country to all Indian reservations. He wanted to conduct a survey to determine how well assimilation was working. And so the report was published in 1928. It's called the Merriam Report, and it concluded unequivocally that assimilation was not working. And assimilation, in fact, was leaving Native communities and reservations far worse than before it had began. So we're talking about high mortality rates. We're talking about extreme poverty that was a consequence of allotment. They looked at things like the goings on and employment rates on reservations. And I feel like he probably wished he didn't name the report after himself, but he did. So if you want more information, you should research the 1928 Merriam Report, but it concluded reservation system and allotment and assimilation was not working. So the federal government said, okay, we're going to move into reorganization. And again, it's important to look at what is going on nationwide as well when we look at, well, I wonder how these federal policies came about, but reorganization was also a response to the Great Depression. So reorganization started work programs on reservations in reservation communities to get the people back to work, but also that was a nationwide effort, again, in response to the Great Depression. So I allocated money for certain work programs, buildings of roads, dams, things like that, just as it was doing on a nationwide scale. And it also concluded that maybe we should allow tribal governments to have a little bit more control. So reorganizing the federal governments looked like these work programs. They created lists of things that they would want that they felt like would make their communities more successful, but also the federal government really encouraged reservation communities and tribes to create their own constitution, create their own systematic rules and ways that they would like to begin governing themselves. The thing about a constitution is it still falls within the paternalistic realm of telling them how to reformulate their government. So it wasn't like reorganization was like, okay, what we're doing isn't working, we're going to give all control back to you. They were encouraged to write a constitution, and some tribes accepted that form of governing, but other tribes were like, no, a constitution is not how we operate. It's not how we want to operate our government.
It's another example, and we'll see this again here in a little while, of the government kind of, it's almost like that for show, like we're giving you back some control, look how great this is, but you have to do it exactly how we want you to. And so really, do you have control? Is that really
strengthening sovereignty?
Exactly. So 2 books here that we have are Counting Coup, Becoming a Crow Chief on the Reservation and Beyond is a Joseph Medicine Crow story. I would say that this is a chapter book that spans a wide age gap. You could use this in middle school and high school, even maybe like 5th and 6th grade reading levels. It is a really good story following Joe Medicine Crow's life. And then we also have The Surrounded here.
That's Darcy McNichol. So a great transitional piece from assimilation and allotment into reorganization. What I love to do with the Joseph Medicine Crow book is I use it to complement the units we do for World War II. So it's a narrative of his involvement in World War II. It's really great. It's a great example also too of maintaining culture. So he talks about his early life on the reservation, and then his participation in World War II, and he completed the 4 steps that was necessary to become a Crow war chief, and he actually became the last Plains war chief. And it's a really cool way to demonstrate to students resiliency, and despite having hardships, he talks about how a lot of his people were hungry when he was a lot younger. Despite having hardships, really that resiliency piece, and you don't have to choose necessarily if you're going to be Native or assimilated today. He did a great job, really inspiring job of maintaining aspects of his culture throughout that involvement in World War II.
Just before we move on, I wanted to address a question that we had. Someone asked if we ever use the word genocide when we're describing events in history. And I would say, yeah, we're not in the business of devaluing Indigenous people by using language that might make other people feel comfortable. It's more about presenting the perspectives of what happened. And so using language that reflects that is really important.
I know I guess it's always been an important issue. It's kind of a more like a hot button issue now. But what I do is I give my students the definition of genocide first, so we can establish together, we understand what it means and we understand what it is. And then I go through some historical events and federal Indian policy and have them draw their own conclusions, but they draw their own conclusions that this qualifies as cultural genocide.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
We just want to take a quick minute
to buzzing right through a lot of history,
observe and just reflect on the timeline for a moment. So we're buzzing through. So we talked about colonization, we talked about treaty and removal, and then assimilation. It's really important again to acknowledge that these don't stop when another federal policy starts. They're overlapping, making it difficult to, just like the curriculum, okay, we're going one way, and I feel like I know what's going on, I feel like I understand the rules. And it's also important too to look at the the presidents at the time too. So what was going on nationwide? What things were they getting voted in on that they were promising that they would do, not necessarily with American Indian people, but on a nationwide scale of what was priorities at the time.
I also think it's really important when we're using this visual representation of the timeline to put into perspective, especially with students who, like, anyone 5 years older than them is old, right? So when you're putting into perspective, like, your parents were probably alive during this time, your grandparents were alive during this time, and putting into context that this history isn't as far away as our kids feel like, just because time is a hard concept. And the older you get, the more you really realize, oh, the thing I think happened, a long time ago really just happened. And so thinking about how close this is to our present time in the grand scheme of things is also a really important topic to touch on.
PBS did. So PBS, Our Spirits Don't Speak English?
No, I think it's Mosaic, or I can't remember. We'll look it up.
The documentary, I know for sure, is called Our Spirits Don't Speak English.
Yes, it is.
But it's something that we use with our students, and we also do a film class with our educators. And what I love about Our Spirits Don't Speak English is that the people that they are interviewing that experienced boarding schools, those interviews are not in black and white, they are in color. And so, as Miranda was saying, when children are exposed to images that are primarily in black and white, we get this idea that, well, that happened a long time ago, that happened a long time ago. And I think it's very powerful that the individuals that are being interviewed, again, are in color, because it puts things into perspective. Like, this didn't actually just happen a long time ago. And we have students in our school district now whose family members attended boarding school. It wasn't that long time ago. The reason that we primarily see those black and white photos is because there was a huge push in terms of propaganda when assimilation started, when the boarding school era started, there was a need to document it so they could demonstrate how well it was working. So you had photographers do crazy things where they would take pictures of students entering boarding school and then take pictures 6 months later, but they would do things like doctor up these photos and even make students' skin lighter. So a lot of the documents are from that time when they're pushing that propaganda because they want to prove how well boarding schools are working, how effective they are. And then after they felt like, okay, well, we're going to move, we're not just going to keep this one boarding school at Carlisle, this is going to be a nationwide effort. We're going to do this all over the place. Once that was successful, there wasn't a real need to document it or photograph it, because they felt like they proved their point that it was working, that it was effective, removing these generations from their culture. And so we don't see a lot of photos in color, even though they had the means to do so, because they already achieved their goal. And that was to move this from the pilot Carlisle boarding school to all across the country. Okay, so relocation,
Getting whiplash yet?
giving tribes more say in their governing practices, a little bit more control of the operations on their reservations. Now we have termination and relocation. So the federal government decided, we want to get out of the Indian business. They felt like, we are allocating too much funds, this is not working. So actually what termination and relocation are is a different form of assimilation. We'll talk about that in a second. But the federal government sought to reverse policies of reorganization and wanted total assimilation. Also, something that was going on nationwide in the 1950s, that's where you see the beginning of integration. So that was the nationwide push of integration and combining white and black schools, white and black businesses, things like that. And so they felt like they needed to do the same thing with American Indian people. So relocation is taking American Indian people, because again, the reservation system, you're getting like-minded individuals consolidated into one area. That's not gonna be a total decimation of culture or languages, things like that. So relocation was a push to get them off reservations and move them into an urban setting, so that you would have a dismantling of people that way. Because if you're relocated to a city like Denver or somewhere in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, these places, the likelihood of you having children with another American Indian person becomes less and less and less, because now you're taken away from this consolidation and disperse in this way.
So then when we are talking about location, we can look at resources like these. These are primary source documents. They are advertisements to promote how great of an idea relocation is. It's very interesting to have conversations surrounding who is this targeting? What are they trying to say? What is the language conveying, or how is the language that is used conveying the message?
So we're going to give you just a couple moments to just reflect on these two examples of advertisements that were put out during termination and relocation. And we're going to ask you to respond in the chat. Who is the targeted audience? What is the message? And I also would like you to observe the language used, the word phrasing. So things like get good jobs. Anything that you notice about these advertisements, anything that sticks out to you? Who's the intended audience? What is the message?
Yeah, great connections. Thank you for participating in the chat if you are able. And a couple of great questions in there. So the first question is, are these, let me go back and find, what is the response from the areas that they're being relocated to? Was it hostile or welcoming? And also, did these ads target Native people who were traditionally from these areas? I'm guessing not.
No. So these were the ads that were dispersed to reservation communities in an effort to inspire them. And a lot of times the federal government would also offer an incentive. So we will pay for your plane ticket or your family to move. We'll help you with rent, things like that, if you agree to relocation. So this was advertisements that were sent to reservation communities. Yeah, be all you can be. I did see one comment that said, happy homes, insinuating that American Indian people already didn't have happy homes. And that's why relocation is so similar to assimilation in boarding schools. It was this assumption that they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the self-actualization to take care of themselves, to take care of their own children. We know what's best. We know what's better for them.
Yeah, a couple of people made connections in the chat saying this is very much promoting a lifestyle in which they felt they wanted American Indian people to be having, which was like their own. So this kind of nuclear family, trade industry jobs, things that like individual ownership being really important to non-native communities, and kind of just that differentiation in what is important in your culture is not necessarily important in other people's cultures, and pushing that, just like Jordan said, as a part of assimilation. Also, it says this seemed effective in dividing people who...
Federal government.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I was like, what? Someone had a question, who is behind these ads? City governments, and Jordan said federal governments. Someone also made a connection to targeting families to disperse them. And so I think, like, kind of that idea of, if they're moved off the reservation and they're away from the reservation, just like in boarding schools, if you're going away, far away from where you are, sending people in Montana to Denver or to Chicago is not something you're familiar with. And they did the same tactic with boarding schools, because you're less likely to return, because it costs money to go back in terms of relocation. It's a lot of circumstantial things that make it harder to leave where you've been brought to. And so the idea being that less people on the reservations, that maybe reservations could go away. We know that's not the case, and we know that's not how that worked out.
And again, conflicting, because during the reservation system and during allotment, they were told farming, 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 farming. Now that there's a different direction that the nation is going in, this industry and production line, they're essentially saying, like, well, you need to get better jobs. You need to get better jobs. And that's with industry jobs, textiles, things like that. It's like, okay, but you told my dad that he needed to be a farmer. You told my grandpa that the only way to make a living is through farming. And now you tell me that the best job I can ever get is working in a factory. So that's not only paternalistic, but it's a shift in directions. Like, I mean, what a concept to go from creating building and jobs locally on the reservation to saying, nope. The way to be successful is if you get a job like this. And notice that these jobs aren't come to Denver and become a doctor, come to Denver and become a podiatrist, an optometrist. It's these textile jobs. And I believe someone mentioned that most of these jobs don't exist anymore as well.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for participating. Lots of great questions. Just making sure someone asked, repeating the years, this would be in the 1950s that these ads would have been coming. Yeah, attempting to isolate from their support systems.
Absolutely. Well, you got to think, if you're a single guy who's being offered the chance of your lifetime and you choose relocation, you accept that, and you're moved to a city, it's that removal of potentially another Native generation, because you're far less likely to have a child with a Native person when you are thrown into a culturally diverse city.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great resource that you can go to, this should be on your resource page. If it's not, I will add it. PowerPoint will be in your folder as well, so you can click on these links. But the Montana Mosaic series has a portion of it that is federal Indian policy, and there is an interview with Carol and the late Stan Juno, and their experiences participating in relocation, and how they saw it from their perspective, and the way that it affected them and their decision to come back to Montana, and how they felt they were made a little bit stronger by their experience.
Yeah. So Stan Juno passed away kind of unexpectedly several months back, and so we just want to acknowledge him, and we want to acknowledge the information that he has given, and his essentially dedicating, him and his wife both dedicating their life's work to things like self-determination and the advancement of American Indian people. But Stan does a really good job of how it felt for him to be relocated to a larger city, and how it sounded like a good idea. And once you got there, there's not people walking alongside you saying, this is how you ride a bus, this is how you do this, this is how you do this. So it was very discombobulating and ultimately not successful either.
Yeah, and someone asked the question earlier, this just reminds me now of their answer, but someone asked the question earlier, like, were they welcomed? And in their interview, Carol talks about how a lot of times they had a really hard time finding housing because they'd call to, the number, and they'd be like, oh yeah, you can come see the place. And then upon realizing that the people coming to see the place were Native American, suddenly someone else already has rented it, I'm sorry. And so really experiencing that over and over again and being faced with that adversity. As Jordan said, they really got to participate in a lot of the events leading up to self-determination, which is essentially started in 1975 with the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act.
Okay, so self-determination was in ways a trickle-down effect from the civil rights movement that was going on nationwide, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was put into place also nationwide in the 60s and 70s. Things were going on, and there was a real push in the 60s and 70s to preserve the environment. So we see a lot of environmental groups, things like PETA, all of this stuff really beginning to get traction. And so there was a real beginning stage of romanticizing American Indian culture in the 60s and 70s. Everyone wanted to be a hippie, and they felt like American Indian people really encapsulated the idea of loving Mother Earth and things like that. And I'm not saying that it was necessarily untrue, but we really see this push for people to try to simplify their life and kind of return to a more simplified version away from the industry period. In 1978, you get the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. That's always very surprising for my students when we're talking about things that conflicted and things that overlap that didn't quite make sense. We talk about things like, what the Constitution guarantees you as an American citizen, and if American Indian people were granted citizenship in 1924, why is it that an act needs to be passed in 1978 that guarantees them religious freedom? Because under the Constitution, they should already be guaranteed the same civil rights, the same luxuries as all American citizens. And that, in fact, was not the case. And again, really reiterating to students that federal Indian policy has made American Indian people the most regulated in the United States. Also, something that happened during self-determination is in 1990, the Indian Arts and Craft Act, and there was also some education legislation passed as well during this time. So we are currently in self-determination, and it's hard for students and others to conceptualize, because if we're in self-determination now and tribes are acting as sovereign nations and this and that, it seems to them as it's always been this way, but they don't understand that this overlap and conflicting experience has a lasting impact on generations. If people are still alive today that survived the boarding school era didn't just end for them when self-determination started.
Yeah, there are a lot of great resources that are going to be able to be topics of conversation when you're talking about American Indian people regaining some control in their governments and in their systems and the way they want to run their lives. And so thinking about presenting things like contemporary issues, there are lots of contemporary issues happening that directly relate to the Self-Determination Act, for example.
So we just had a question about the boarding schools. And boarding schools, there are still several boarding schools still operating today, but during self-determination, you get that shift of tribal control. So the tribes have input on things like curriculum and stuff like that. So there's still places that house American Indian students, but during self-determination, you have more tribal control. We have 2 BIA schools operating in Montana as well. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I
No.
just saw the question.
We want to answer questions for sure.
So as Miranda was saying, some online resources that we use, I use Indian Country Today at least several times a week. And it's really great for current events, not only just in Montana, but nationwide things that are happening. And I sometimes I pick particular articles because I think they're really good example of certain federal policies, but we pick articles in Indian Country Today, and to make it meaningful, you know, we read what's happening today, the current event of today, but then we're able to go back and see, okay, but what federal policies have led up to this? Everyday Native is also really great. It's grades 4 through 12 online resource. You have to subscribe to it, but it's free.
Native Knowledge 360 is also a really great interactive partnership with the Smithsonian. And then OPI obviously also features a lot of really great resources. One of the ways that I talk about self-determination is through artists and their work, and really the rise of American Indian art and regaining that power and control through their artwork. So an example that you can talk about ledger art. We'll talk about art next time in the deeper dive, if you're able to join us, and how you can utilize that in your classroom. This book, This Land Is My Land, is by George Littlechild, and it features some of his work. He has 2 different books that feature his work and some writings that go along with it. And they have some really great topics. You can look at this artwork and do writing. You can do your own artwork. You can come up with a lot of ideas to incorporate contemporary issues using art.
Absolutely true. Diary of a Part-Time Indian is a great example of a contemporary setting of a young boy growing up on a reservation, but you have examples of federal policy and how it affected the generation before him, how it affected his parents, and also what it looks like for him. So things that are still impacting his life because of consequences of the federal government.
I'm going to share, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's
while
okay.
I get the video ready.
Okay, so we just had a question about when I teach Alexi, how do I address the issues of sexual harassment and accusations against him? So obviously, I mean, he put educators in a really bad spot with that whole situation. He has since formally apologized. And the way I look at it is also when I'm vetting materials is if it's good for my students, then the answer is yes. And I know the connections that students make with his writing, and I know what it means to them to see themselves represented in a contemporary setting and in the material and how engaged they are. And even though it's a really unfortunate circumstance, I still continue to teach Sherman Alexi in my classroom because, again, if it's good for students, the answer for me will always be yes.
Thank you for that question. All right, we're going to watch the conclusion of our interview with Jennifer, and then we will wrap up our session.
I honestly think that the students walk away with a sense that they're important too. We have such a high Native population in Great Falls Public Schools, and they need to be addressed as well. Their history needs to be shared, and they need to learn about themselves because most of the things they've learned about themselves are really, really negative. And that doesn't do anything good for their self-esteem, their identity, their sense of learning. There's no ownership in that learning because nothing's about them. So when you make it about them and you show them both sides of the story and you show them that they are represented and that they are important and that there's so many cool things culturally about the things in their lives and their families' lives and their history with things. I definitely feel like it changes their perspective on school and learning. They just want to be included. They just want to know that they're special too, because a lot of the things that they've learned about themselves aren't good and aren't special. So to give them a sense of importance in their identity, I think is always a good end goal. Yeah, it is for everybody. Everybody can learn from our history. Everybody can learn from both sides of our history. It doesn't matter what color you are, but there are a lot of aha moments for the other students when we say to them, oh yeah, look, Columbus wrote in here, they'll make perfect slaves. It's interesting, you know, because everyone will, you know, it doesn't matter what color you are, but everyone goes, oh, you know, like, I can't believe he wrote that. But sharing that is important for everybody. My kids are like, whoa, that happened. Or, you know, they'll say, oh, we did that to them. And I'll say, yeah, but you didn't do anything to anyone, okay? This is a historical event that happened in history. You didn't do anything to anyone. We are learning. Once we learn, we know better, we know more, we do better. So yeah, history is full of terrible things, and history is full of so many mistakes that people have made. How about we learn about them and grow from them and fix them? Once we know better, we do better. And that comes with learning, that comes with time. You don't just know all things all the time, you have to learn. So learning lots of perspectives and learning about lots of different people and learning about other cultures other than yourselves, once you know better, you do better.
We're back. So just to kind of finish out our evening, thank you so much for participating. And I hope that you took a lot away from Jennifer's words, because she does really have a lot of great information to share. So we have a reflection question for you to answer in the chat.
Throughout history, the federal government has created and recreated new rules, policies concerning American Indian people. How has this constant change made it difficult for American Indian people to establish strong governments and communities? How have these policies treated American Indian people as second-class citizens? And who do these policies usually benefit once they're written? So as we wind down, please feel free to respond in the chat, but also these would be also potential questions that you could take back to your class when you're having conversations concerning federal policy. Yep. Nate, that was very poetic.
Yeah. For those of you that might not have seen, he said, it's always hard to play the game when the people in charge keep changing the rules. And that really does sum up that idea. Yeah, not allowing for stability. And a great reflection of those policies really benefiting the people in charge. That's just a good question to ask your students anytime we're talking about anything to do with laws, rules, and regulations, is who is who's making this law? Who does it benefit?
Yeah, so it's advertised in one way and marketed as the best idea ever, but someone's usually going to benefit a little bit more than someone else.
So we want to value your time. It is 5:30. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Jennifer might have a few closing words for you to do so that you can get any renewal units you might need. But really, thank you for joining us and bearing through 500 years of history with us. That's a lot of information to get at one time.
Hope you wore something comfortable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies, so much for all of your preparation and making this such a great experience in learning for so many people. And thank you to all of you who have joined us here tonight, this evening, for taking the time to dig deeper and learn more. In the chat, there is the link to this feedback survey. Again, even if you're not pursuing renewal units, we sure would love to have your feedback. I also put the dates, so save the date for our free virtual Indian Education for All Best Practices Conference, which will be on May 15th and 16th. So please watch our website. And also all of the resources are updated in the participant folder. So please make sure to take advantage of those. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you all so much. Have great spring breaks. Oh, and we will see you back here April 21st. So we're taking a little pause because there are so many different spring breaks. Have a safe spring breaks, have a safe spring, and we'll see you in about a month, April 21st.